format of today is that we have two very special speakers. The first of those, Lucy Michael, will give us an analysis of the data, especially within the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. And then we will have Raquel McKee, who will give us a response to Lucy's presentation. Just to give you a little bit of introduction to both of our speakers, Lucy is a research and training consultant in the areas of integration, equality and diversity. And her work has addressed a range of equality and integration concerns from the workplace, education to policing, also looking at racist discrimination and violence and the experience of victims, as well as the roles that statutory institutions and civil society can play in combating discrimination and exclusion. And then Raquel is a workshop facilitator and educator working on diversity and inclusion with a particular focus on racial justice. And Raquel has worked with Community Arts Partnership on intercultural research, as well as with Create Ireland in a similar capacity. Raquel is a master's graduate from Queen's University, and today she's speaking to us in her capacity as chair of the Strategy and Lobbying Group within the African and Caribbean Support Organisation of Northern Ireland, ACSONI. So I'd like to welcome Lucy and Raquel to the event today. And I'm going to turn off my camera now, and Lucy will give us a presentation. And hopefully the technology will work well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula, for that lovely introduction, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, and we appreciate you giving up your time to be with us today. We hope that you find it a very interesting and engaging webinar, and I'm really grateful to Raquel for taking the time to join us today to share her thoughts on this very interesting topic. So let me just bring up a PowerPoint for us to have a look at. So the first thing, as Paula said, is that today's presentation is on the new research update, which is now available on the ARK website. And that and this webinar recording will be there for you to share with colleagues and friends for some time to come. The data that we're using is just over 1,200 interviews with adults over 18 across Northern Ireland that's captured in the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey. That has some self-completion a format to it, and also the Young Life and Times survey, which is over 1,100 surveys completed by 16-year-olds and returned online or by post. The focus of this is to take the data specifically from both of those surveys on social attitudes towards Black, minority, ethnic and Indigenous peoples in Northern Ireland, and because of the overlap, to also look at attitudes to immigration and refugees there. The title of our seminar today, Black Lives Matter ? Really came out of our a determination to interrogate the data that we do have, limited as it is in some respects, to see if we can see, are there patterns in the attitudes in Northern Ireland today, what those patterns look like, positive and negative, where there is hope warranted and where more work needs to be done. And we hope that you will bring your questions to the Q&A at the end. And again, Raquel will feed in her thoughts on that. So I suppose let's start with an overview of who we are in Northern Ireland today. We remain the least ethnically diverse region in the UK. We have just 1.8% belonging to minority ethnic groups of our normal residents in 2011. Of course, that was the last census. And so we may see some changes by the next one, but those are the figures that we work with right now. If you compare that membership of ethnic minority groups with, for example, those in A8 countries, Central and Eastern European nationals, you'll see that it's lower. So we've got more people in that group of Central and Eastern Europe in Northern Ireland at 2.2% than we do from all other ethnic minority groups. So let's just take a look specifically at who are in those ethnic minority groups so that we can understand the background to those attitudes we're looking at in this research update. The largest group, according to the Northern Ireland census, is that of Asian. Now that breaks down to around 8,000 South Asians, that's Indian, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and around 6,000 people of Chinese background. And so we might well have cause to look at those Asian groups. Today, we've chosen specifically to look at Black and Indigenous groups, so Black and Irish traveller groups, and perhaps next year with certainly the interest caused around hate crimes and COVID, we might well look at some of those other groups. But for today, we want to draw out some of the comparisons, some of the racial hierarchies around these groups, and Black and Traveller are the ones that I'll be talking most about. So you can see that these are relatively small populations, with just over 3,500 people who are Black or Black British at that 2011 census, and just over 1,300 Irish travellers in that census too. So in looking at our attitudes, the background certainly is that these are relatively small numbers. That's not to say that they're homogenous. One of the issues that we have in policy in Northern Ireland, as many of you will be familiar with, is that those small numbers do not necessarily mean that everybody has the same experience. In fact, captured in those small groups is a relatively high diversity of nationalities, ethnicities, religion, culture, class and income, and length of residence in Northern Ireland. So there are no sweeping statements to be made about any of those groups in Northern Ireland. But of course, the issue of policymaking for small numbers means that very often they are considered in relatively generalised ways. So our interest today really is not the direct experience of those groups, but rather attitudes towards them. And that's the focus of the data that we're looking at here. I suppose the first thing to say is, what's the general view of diversity in Northern Ireland? So let me start there. Are the benefits of diversity, which were so lauded, around the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, around that idea of diversity as a benefit to Northern Ireland, reshaping community relations, has that had any impact? What kind of approach is there to that positive view of diversity today? Well, one of the questions that's been used in the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey and the Young Life and Times survey over the last number of years is this one. Do the culture and traditions of different minority ethnic groups add to the richness and diversity of Northern Ireland society? And we see a relatively positive view here. 61% of adults and just over half of 16-year-olds feel yes. So far, so good. We at least have some recognition of those positive benefits of diversity. Now, that's a very broad question, so people who generally have more nuanced views than that, but it's a good starting place for us to jump off from. The other question we want to look at, which specifically mentions the attitudes to Black or Black British, is do you have friends from other ethnic minority groups? And I'm just going to take two here to compare, one from Black and minority ethnic and one from white other. So when we look at people who say they have Black friends, we see that just 14% of people in the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, so that's 14% of people over 18, say they have Black friends. Now, it's never been particularly high. It's the highest it's ever been was in 2017 when 19% of people said they had Black friends. It is lower now than it has ever been, though. That maybe shouldn't be the case. It may be about the sample, of course, but it certainly behoves us to note that just 14% of people know somebody or friends with somebody who is Black in Northern Ireland, and that may mean that the development of attitudes towards people who are of African descent may be much more influenced by other factors, by media, by political statements, or the global news. So we want to be quite aware of that for some groups, we might well learn more from our friends and colleagues and schoolmates and workmates about different ethnic or national backgrounds. But in Northern Ireland, that lack of diversity really could be holding us back in that regard. If we compare how many people say they have friends of Polish background, 28% in 2019 said that they had Polish friends. Now that is actually much lower than it was, sorry, the slide says 2019, should say 2018. It's fallen by 9% in a year. So I'd be quite curious about the patterns here. Do people have friends from other backgrounds? Why are those numbers falling? Not only in terms of people who are claiming a Black friend, but also those who are claiming a Polish friend. People who say that they have friends from other ethnic backgrounds The lowest number of those is amongst the oldest age group. Now, there may be a number of reasons for that. I wouldn't necessarily interpret that as being about racial prejudice, but it could certainly be the fact that diversity in Northern Ireland has very much been a picture of Northern Irish life since 1997. So older age groups may not have been in the kind of friendship forming patterns that we might see diverse friendships accumulating in. So I wouldn't draw any particular conclusions about racism from that, but it is, of course, useful to notice that that any racial prejudice that develops doesn't have the counter of having diverse friendships to balance it out. I want to look particularly then at the experience of 16-year-olds. We might think that 16-year-olds will tell us something a little bit about what kinds of influences are young people seeing around them, how are they interpreting racism or prejudice as they see it in their daily lives, and what impact is it having on their views. In just 2 years' time, these people will be voters. In fact, now a year's time, they'll be voters. Nearly half of them, rather worryingly, said that they had witnessed racist bullying or harassment. So 16-year-olds are saying, to a far greater extent than those who are saying that they have diverse friendships, are witnessing racist bullying and harassment. A third have rarely or never socialized or played sport with people from a different ethnic background. So these are people who may well be in cross-community relations, but not when we think about people of different ethnicities. 33%, another third, say they sometimes socialize or play sport with people from a different ethnic background. And I suppose on the good side, nearly 30% say they do that very often. So what we're seeing is that diversity of friendships is not evenly spread across the community. Less than a third are saying they do that very often. So again, we're looking at the possibility that racial prejudice is really against a background of lack of exposure to people of other ethnic backgrounds, and the opportunity that those diverse friendships bring for understanding and reckoning in terms of our own attitudes. So let's have a look at how we assess our own prejudice then. What do we think of ourselves when we think about ourselves being prejudiced towards people of other ethnicities? Well, 69% of us in Northern Ireland, and again, this is adults, think that they're not at all prejudiced against people of other ethnicities. A quarter say they're a little prejudiced. And I suppose I'm going to be optimistic about this, and I'm going to say just 4% say that they are very prejudiced. Now, when Paula and I have done previous research updates, we've looked at that extreme minority in terms of attitudes to migrant workers, in terms of attitudes to refugees, in terms of attitudes to immigration. And right across Europe, what we see is that extreme element, those who are extremely anti-immigration, extremely anti-diversity, who very much sit apart from the rest of the population in terms of their views, we're looking at around 6%. So I'm optimistic when I say that 4% think that they're not very prejudiced, because certainly in the surveys across Europe that demonstrate that 6% is fairly constant. These are people who acknowledge and are not that bothered about their own prejudice. So I'm going to take that 4% as being relatively consistent with the rest of Europe, perhaps even a good sign, though not significant enough to warrant that conclusion. Let's have a look at who those are that say that they're not at all prejudiced. Relatively similar patterns across a lot of different groups in terms of whether they are prejudiced. And as in previous research updates, when we've looked at attitudes specifically to migrant workers, refugees, immigration, and so on, we see a slight difference between people of Catholic and Protestant background and those who are of no religious background. So we see just a little variation there. Catholics believe that they are slightly less prejudiced than Protestants believe of themselves. Again, this is a self-assessment. It doesn't tell us about people's prejudices per se. It tells us about what people believe about themselves. So there's limited conclusions to be drawn there, but nonetheless, it is worth saying that continues a pattern that we've seen right across the last decade. And we'll break that down in terms of what those hierarchies look like later on. Let's compare that to 16-year-olds then. Again, we had seen 25% of adults said they were a little prejudiced. That's down to just 15% for 16-year-olds, and those very prejudiced down to 1%. So 16-year-olds see themselves as less prejudiced than adults, at 73% saying they're not at all prejudiced. Here, there's not much difference between people of Catholic and Protestant background or those of no religion. In fact, the most significant difference is between boys and girls. So 16-year-olds, females are more likely than males to consider themselves not prejudiced at 77% compared to 67%. So it may well be that that our teenagers have less significant differences in terms of their background and its impact on prejudice. We'll have to watch and see what they look like when they come into that 18-year-old cohort in the Northern Ireland Life and Times in a year or so. We can look then at attitudes to immigration, again related to questions of racial bias. Immigration is a question that very often is perceived in racial terms, even if in fact it very often relates to a large majority of white and other groups rather than other Black and minority ethnic groups. So in Northern Ireland, of course, immigration has been very much largely around white European groups. But when the question is asked globally, very often people think of immigrants as being other than themselves, and particularly in case of ethnicity or religion. So in Northern Ireland, what does it look like? Well, in the 2019 survey, in the Northern Ireland Life and Terms survey, so this is adults, around half say that immigration should neither increase or decrease, but stay the same as it was in 2019. So they didn't want to see any different. Around the same number as wanted an increase, also wanted it decreased. So 20% wanting an increase, 18% wanting it decreased. Of course, remember that the majority of these respondents are white British or Irish. What does that look like in the wider context? Well, it's much more positive than the UK more generally. In the 2019 survey in the UK said that 44% favoured decreased immigration. Now, that had been what Northern Ireland looked like back pre-Brexit debates. In 2014, nearly the same number, 46% in Northern Ireland wanted decreased immigration. But as we've seen in other research updates, the power of those debates in Northern Ireland, media coverage, political statements, and so on, has been quite significant. And I would posit that there is a relationship between that public discourse and the fact that now people recognise immigration within those wider questions, particularly in terms of the question around Brexit, migrant workers, who belongs in Northern Ireland, and so on. So I think it's quite a significant change to see us going from almost half of people surveyed in Northern Ireland wanting a decrease in immigration to just 18% wanting it decreased in 2019. So a good positive picture on this data. I want then to interrogate what that looks like in terms of different ethnic minority groups. Who is it that is most accepted when we think about immigrants or minority residents and citizens of Northern Ireland? And what we know is that, globally, there are groups that are more or less accepted. So we've seen that when we talk about particular groups of refugees, for example, some groups of refugees are more accepted than others, depending on their religion, nationality, and most importantly, the kinds of media and political responses that there have been to that group. So we've seen, for example, much more positive attitudes to Syrian refugees because of the coverage of their government responses to them than to other types of refugees. What does that look like then when we look at interpersonal relations more generally in Northern Ireland? I'm quite interested in the overlap between the experiences of Black and Indigenous communities globally. Now we know that in the US, of course, that Black Lives Matter movement this year very much incorporated claims from Indigenous peoples right across the United States, but also Canada, and about that common experience of cultural erasure, criminalization, problems with criminal justice agencies, and exclusion more generally in society. Now, in Northern Ireland, of course, that debates around Black Lives Matter have not been around armed policing per se. They've been around those broader equality questions of exclusion in education, public attitudes, social distance, and the absence, I suppose, of minority voices in policy making. And that's an experience that's shared not only by Black and Indigenous communities here in Northern Ireland, but other ethnic minority groups too. Much of it for the small numbers reason that I talked about at the start, but also that racial ignorance. And so we wanted to look and see, were there racial hierarchies in this Northern Ireland Life and Times data? Certainly I've seen it in previous Northern Ireland Life and Times data, and I was curious to see if it showed up here. Now, we don't have data specifically about people of African descent in this particular set of questions, but we do have Irish travellers. And what we've seen is that Irish acceptance of Irish travellers is particularly low. And we know that there are other things that are shared by Black and Irish traveller groups in the UK and Northern Ireland. One of those is negative media coverage. The attitudes to certain groups like Black people and Irish travellers can be about that social distance, not knowing people, but that negative media coverage certainly upsets the balance quite significantly. We know, for example, that on the island of Ireland, more than half of newspaper sales is from UK newspapers. So never mind Northern Ireland, right across the island, that UK news coverage is really affecting how we think about particular ethnic groups. So let's have a look at some of the data on social distance here. Would respondents to the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey accept as a colleague at work someone who was Eastern European, Muslim or Irish traveller? Right up front here, we see that hierarchy kicking in, where those who are Eastern European background are more likely to be accepted as a colleague at work than anyone who's Muslim or an Irish traveller. When we look then to whether they might be accepted as a relative through marriage, again, we see the same hierarchy. And this is reflected right through the data. And it's quite consistent across the last number of years. So again, here we see Eastern Europeans accepted as a relative through marriage at 80%, quite high. Muslims quite a bit lower at 64%, and Irish travellers right down there at 58%. When we dig deeper into the data to see if there's differences across the communities, we can see that for Irish travellers, there's a very significant difference. And this is the most significant difference of any of the groups. Whether Eastern European or Muslim, people of Catholic and Protestant background are not particularly different in how they're discerning towards those groups. But when it comes to Irish travellers, Catholics are much more positive about Irish travellers in the workplace than people of Protestant background. And specifically when it comes to marrying Irish travellers, to having a relative through marriage, Catholics are much more positive on that than people of Protestant background. So, just at certain points through the data, we see those Catholic background, Protestant background differences coming through. And so while in lots of the data, they're not very significant, we can really see when it comes to racial hierarchies and acceptances of certain groups, that is, it becomes evident. So what do our respondents think about whether Northern Ireland is welcoming? Well, the first question that they were asked, both adults and 16-year-olds, was, is it our duty to provide protection to refugees escaping persecution in their home country? It was important to me to interrogate this data, not only to get a broader understanding of how people feel about attitudes in general in Northern Ireland, but also because of the overlap with Black groups in Northern Ireland. One of the experience in many cases of being refugees, but two, because the research, particularly by Fiona Murphy and Ulrika Wheaton at Queen's, has shown that there is widespread confusion, that people of African descent in Northern Ireland are often mistaken for refugees when they are in fact not. So that's why I wanted to interrogate particularly this data on attitudes to refugees. So 65% of adults believe that it's our duty in Northern Ireland to provide protection to refugees. Disappointingly, only 58% of 16-year-olds, but I'm not going to read too much into that difference at this stage. When we look at the adults, we can see, in fact, that people who are middle-aged, 45 to 54, are much more accepting of refugees than those who are 18 to 24. So there's certainly something around the 16-year-olds up to 24 that makes them less inclined to say that we have a duty to provide protection to refugees. When we actually ask people, is Northern Ireland a society that welcomes refugees? In other words, does Northern Irish society match your views on welcoming refugees? We see a more negative picture. The same respondents who said that it was a duty of people in Northern Ireland to provide protection now say that they don't feel that other people in Northern Ireland think the same. So while 65% of adults felt they had a duty, they felt that Northern Ireland was welcoming at a much lesser pace. And the same was true of 16-year-olds. So they're less optimistic about the attitudes of their fellow residents and citizens in Northern Ireland than they are of their own views. Are things changing in terms of racial prejudice? Well, respondents were asked, were they positive about the changing nature of racial prejudice in Northern Ireland? Is there more or less than 5 years ago? And a third believe it's about the same. A few people believe it's increasing, but far less than in the previous year. And a few more believe it's decreasing, again, far more than in the previous year. So these are the views of the majority of respondents, being white, British and Irish, about racial prejudice in Northern Ireland. It's a fairly optimistic picture. More people believe it's decreasing than increasing, and those figures look good compared to 2018. As well as that, if we look at the data outside of this particular survey and look at PSNI data that we cite in the report, we can see that hate crimes have been broadly decreasing since 2014, minor blip in 2017, 2018, but part of a larger downward trend. So is that optimism matched by what we've seen across the rest of the survey? Unfortunately not. Overall, those attitudes really have not improved since 2016. So we're looking at those third who believe it's the same as 5 years ago are absolutely right. There is a relatively unchanging picture in terms of attitudes to BME groups. So we're more optimistic in Northern Ireland than we are realistic about those changes. And that makes us think, what is it that we need to do next? So let me leave you with a few thoughts on what our next steps are. First thing is to say is that we are at midpoint of the racial equality strategy for Northern Ireland. It would be a good time to review that strategy and to see whether it is achieving the kind of changes in public attitudes and understanding that a racial equality strategy should achieve. The second thing is that the European Commission has just this year launched its new anti-racism action plan for the next 5 years. It's quite a forward-thinking document and well worth thinking about incorporating that good practice into Northern Ireland. We're still looking at a refugee integration strategy for Northern Ireland, something that's crucial not only to the experience of refugees in Northern Ireland, but also to that broader understanding and empathy towards refugees, as well as solidarity with refugees, really key to changing public attitudes. And overall, what more can we do to change public attitudes in Northern Ireland? So thank you for listening to the presentation. I'm going to hand over then to Raquel, and I'm really looking forward to hearing her comments, and I'll be back to you for our Q&A. Thanks a million.
Lucy, thank you very much for that. It was quite in depth and very insightful. And thank you very much, Paula, for inviting me and having me along. Thanks to everybody here who's made the time to be here. So Lucy, that was quite interesting, and there are a number of things that I have pulled out from what you have said. One of the first things that I want to say is how much we welcome the research. This is quite important that the NILT and the YLT research has been done so that we get a sense and a flavour of what the attitudes to Black people and travellers in minority ethnic communities in Northern Ireland are. It is very important for us to know where we stand, because we can't really change things unless we know. I welcome the fact that there are increasing levels of optimism towards minority groups. Especially, for instance, the statistic that spoke about 4% of adults and only 1% of 16-year-olds saying that they're extremely prejudiced. That is quite hopeful, and hopefully in the future, you know, these figures will decrease again and things will become even more positive. I found it interesting that in 2018, people's attitude to immigration was that it should neither increase nor decrease, that there was more positive approach to this and attitude towards this in Northern Ireland than in the rest of the UK. with only 18% wanting immigration to decrease. I also found it interesting too that our attitudes and approaches to different groups are different, that some groups are more accepted, other groups less so. And of course, I'm glad you flagged up the importance of political response and attitudes, as well as media attitude and response, which of course have an impact in how the public view these different groups. I found it interesting too, your information about global response to Irish travellers and to people of African descent in particular. These two groups, of course, seem to be at the narrow end of the wedge when it comes to the attitudes towards migrants and to people of minority ethnic groups. But I am intrigued, I suppose is the way to put it, about the comment about people being more optimistic than realistic. And I'm hoping that more data will become available in the future for us to delve into this a little bit more to find out, you know, what the discrepancy is, why there is a difference between, you know, what is the reality as against what we believe to be the reality. That's quite an interesting bit of the findings. I want to bring up a few points for consideration, and some of them are things that Lucy has already mentioned, which is the point about the groups in Northern Ireland not being homogenous groups. I wanted to hammer home the fact that even though it's 1.8% of the population, that a broad brushstroke is not sufficient when we are approaching matters that impact on these groups. It needs to be approached carefully, and the policies that are made and decisions that are being taken need to look a little bit more carefully at the details of the groups that it will affect, rather than just saying 1.8% of the population, therefore we can do one thing and that should cover everybody, because that genuinely is not acceptable and it's not enough to make enough difference to the real life, the reality that we're talking about. Another one is the fact that the Good Friday Agreement pointed to the benefits of diversity. And my question with that is, how are we outliving that? Are we in our communication, in our media, in our attitudes in policy and in politics, are we actually showing that we actually value diversity? So just wanted to flag that one up. Another one was 14% of 18-year-olds said that they had Black friends. Has been higher, sorry, not 18-year-olds, 14% of over 18s, that means adults, said that they had Black friends. It has been higher in the past. And I'm wondering why those numbers are falling, and would be very interested for further research to look into that. I am questioning in the back of my mind about whether the EU referendum might have had an impact on that, because of all the negative attitude that was being bandied about pre-Brexit, with all the negative stereotypes around immigrants that were being portrayed in politics and in the media, and wondering, you know, has that impacted the attitudes that people have to making relationships with people from of African descent and travelers as well. I would presume that they are included in that. We need to be very careful about the narrative that is in policy and the narrative that is portrayed in the media. Many people in the community are not reporting hate incidents and crimes, as they have lost confidence in the process. They're concerned about further intimidation. They're concerned about their own resources, their health, their interests. A number of the people who are experiencing these hate incidents and hate crimes have a very small support network. And sometimes it comes down to them prioritizing survival over fighting injustice. And that will have a knock-on effect on the data that the police are capturing and the statistics that we are getting. We need to be thinking about how we can support individuals in these community groups who are experiencing these things so that they can feel a level of confidence to report these incidents and these crimes and feel as though they can follow through with it to a satisfactory resolution. Hate incidents and hate crimes could well have only become more underreported rather than actually having reduced, as the statistics might suggest. Just want to throw those in there for points to consider. Another one, of course, is that nearly half of the 18-year-olds have witnessed racist bullying and harassment. That's very interesting to me, especially when we consider that the population in Northern Ireland is so small. If the population is 1.8% of the whole demographic, and more than half of our 16-year-olds are witnessing racial bullying and harassment, that is telling a story all on its own. And that's something as a country that we should be uncomfortable with, and we should be making steps to address. I wanted to just think now about some of the issues that we need to be looking at and concerned about. And one of them, I think one of the major ones would be media portrayal. I have to say, in the past, ARK Seminar has tackled this, looking at the way people of African descent are portrayed in media. We all know about those images of Black children with flies around their mouth, etc., that spawn negative perceptions of people of African descent and have a detrimental impact on the way people view and relate to people of African descent. This, thankfully, has been addressed too by the DOCAS code about how media images are portrayed, and I'm very pleased about that being in existence. But I think it's something that we probably need to increase the visibility of and probably prioritize somewhat more. As I mentioned before, I believe that reforms are needed in the area of victim support in Northern Ireland. If we have victims of hate crime who do not feel that the process and the system is going to actually take a matter through to conclusion, then they're not going to come forward, they're not going to report the incidents. If we have victims also who don't, excuse me, who don't feel that they have the support networks around them. And by that, I'm not just talking about organizations like ARK Seminar or organizations like Northwest Migrants Forum. I'm talking also about the family level support. For instance, if somebody needs to be reporting a hate incident or a hate crime, what's happening to their child at the time when they're doing that? Where is the support that's going to enable that child to be looked after while the parent is dealing with the PSNI? That kind of thing, you know. If the family, for instance, is then suffering from the trauma, where is the support for that individual? Where is the support for that family? You know, what systems have we put in place to aid people who have been through these experiences to ensure that they come through it the other side with good mental health, and also feel as though if something were to happen again, that they would once again report these incidents. I have to say, I have personally been, a family member of a hate incident, and even though it was not a hate crime, it was an extremely traumatic experience, and it kept me awake at night, and it kept me worrying during the day for my family. And, you know, while there are victim support networks available, I just want to interrogate the question of just how effective are they? Just how widespread are they? Is there enough, etc.? Those kinds of questions, just want to throw those into the mix. And once again, to just say, you know, the trauma support is an integral part of it that should be considered and should be brought to bear on this. But perhaps the most important point that I would want to bring to this conversation is the whole elephant in the room issue, which is the whole question of systemic racism or institutional racism. Until that is addressed, we will never really get rid of the attitudes towards migrants and the attitudes towards people of African descent that currently pertains. We, at the moment, are in a position where we believe and we claim that there is no systemic racism. The people in our communities would beg to differ quite severely, quite significantly. And I would personally welcome whether NILT or YLT would be able to do some research into this to begin to get some data as to whether and where the systemic racism is showing itself. You know, the anecdotal evidence that we have from our communities demonstrates that it is not as easy. It is not a level playing field. It is not you know, a situation of just try harder. So I believe that this is an important area that is causing great harm and causing disadvantage to our community, and it's bringing individuals to the point where they need extra support. And as a system, as a society, this is something that needs to be addressed. We cannot continue to pretend that that it's not an issue, that it's not a case. And even if the research then finds that there is no such thing, then at least we would have data on which we can base this. Okay, although I don't highlight that the data would prove that there is no such thing. Even the very fact that the Macpherson report states what it does tells us that across the UK, this is an issue, and no doubt here in Northern Ireland, those attitudes and perceptions prevail. I think one of the key things that needs to happen is for us to begin to bring institutions to the place of recognizing that they need to increase the levels of racial justice that pertain in their organizations. We need to find ways to bring them to account and help them to move up, step up, and become more responsible about this. The Black Lives Matter protest is one example of you know, where people in the community have felt that there is a level of injustice and there is a level of systemic injustice in place. And we are working hard to amplify the voices of the community in calling for change and reform around racial justice. Groups like AXONI and groups like the Northwest Migrants Forum and Africa House and various others have been speaking about this for years. We have been asking for change, and I think, as I said before in one of my poetic pieces, time come. We are at that critical moment where things need to change, and Northern Ireland needs to wake up to this and needs to make changes that will be persistent and long-lasting. To ignore this and to misunderstand this will increase the level of suffering, the level of inequality, etc., that is experienced by people of Black and minority ethnic groups. And of course, it means that these individuals cannot contribute to the Northern Ireland society at their highest potential. That is not what any society would want from its citizens. It's not what any society would want of the residents in its community. So those are my thoughts, and I'm hoping that all made sense. I should have probably shown it to you on the PowerPoint. I do have one, but I didn't share screen. I'm happy now to hand back over to you, Paula.
Okay, well, thank you very much both to Lucy and Raquel for such an in-depth look at the data and exploration of what the issues mean and what they mean in reality for people living here, and also the issues that we as a society and citizens of Northern Ireland need to think about, and perhaps then how that feeds into policymakers and policies that can reflect those concerns as well. I just want to read out a couple of the comments that have come through already, and then perhaps go back to yourself, Lucy. I suppose one of the comments is somebody suggesting that thinking about the people who say that they are a little bit prejudiced isn't perhaps not necessarily a negative thing, but perhaps these people have more insight or a realistic view of the nature of personal prejudice than those who feel they are not prejudiced at all, because you know, sometimes we don't necessarily have a good understanding of our own internal prejudice, or maybe slightly deluding ourselves as well. So I think we have to think of that as well. Someone else that thinks that perhaps for 16-year-olds, with those who have less prejudice, perhaps that's they've been influenced by their school friends and their experiences with people of colour in their day-to-day lives. And again, the role of school is very important. And in this, and somebody else has mentioned that the data today and the discussion is very important for staff and students, both at all levels of school, whether it's primary, secondary, or at third level education as well. I just want to tell people we're recording the videos at the event. It will be available on our website. On our survey website, you can also find tables of results broken down by age, sex, and religious background. I put the link there into the chat function. So if anybody wants to look further at the full set of questions that are available, Lucy has just highlighted some of the a subset of the questions that were asked within that module. So I don't know if you'd like to respond to some of Raquel's very eloquent points.
Thanks, Paula, and thank you, Raquel, for a brilliant account of what the data means for you and those insights. And you've certainly brought out some of the most important points from that data, and I'm really grateful for that. Let me just tackle a few of those points that Paula has made, and then I want to make a general comment back in response to some of the things Raquel has made. Firstly, in terms of understanding people's self-assessment of their prejudice, certainly when Paula and I have done previous research updates, we've noted that people who were sort of 18 to 30s group were much more likely to acknowledge their own prejudice than people who are older. And that may well be about people understanding the limits of their own ability to overcome bias. You know, certainly in my teaching career, you know, always the first lesson was to talk to students and say, you know, the quicker you can recognize your own prejudice, the quicker you're going to get over them. But to start from the point of saying I have no prejudices is to stop the learning right away. There's certainly that perhaps generational impact of Black-led movements that have talked about the importance of understanding the limits of our ability to overcome the biases that come from the structures in our society around us. You know, and it's been Black activists that have led that conversation globally, and it's a very helpful conversation. You know, and again, Raquel has been here today talking about how that structural racism has such an impact on us. So yeah, very interesting when you look at the 18 to 30s versus the older groups in terms of acknowledging prejudice. Again, this is a limit of the self-assessment data. That's why I like to put it side by side along with the social distance data of, you know, who would accept others in their workplace or marriage, and alongside that data on refugees and immigration. In a previous update that we published last year, which you can see on the ARK website as well, we looked at attitudes to migrant workers, and we specifically looked at that more extreme group who felt that immigration was damaging access to housing, access to education, and access to health. And again, we saw broadly a more positive response in those areas than in the UK more generally. Again, I think that is very much influenced by the positive approach to immigration that has been part of the debates on Brexit in Northern Ireland versus the debates, particularly in England, looking at the differences there. Raquel is absolutely right to point to the issues with data more generally. We don't know if hate crimes reflect the reporting of hate crimes. And what we do know is that there are big issues with trust of police around immigration questions. We've seen right across the UK and Ireland, police forces using victims' accounts and victims coming forward to do immigration interrogations and to intimidate. You know, racism is as much part of our police forces as it is part of our education staff, healthcare staff. You know, racism doesn't stop when you become part of an organization. And again, that's why it's really important for us to tackle that appearance of neutrality in organizations. You know, organizations have to be ahead of the curve, not behind when it comes to tackling racism. So Raquel, I'm so grateful for you to raise both those points, one on the data and the reluctance to engage sometimes with police, the investment of that. And if I leave one last point on that, would be that, you know, the point about being concerned about public attitudes is that it isn't just down to victim support groups or groups like Axoni and Northwest Migrant Forum. Community solidarity right across the community is so important. You know, just in down here in Fingal, in Balbriggan, last week we saw very violent threats on racist graffiti, and the community went out and painted over that. You know, and to see that solidarity right up front is so important to reinforce that sense of belonging. And to say that it was neighbours who went out and painted it over it, not the county council, not the Gardaí, but neighbours who did it is so important. I'll stop there and let you do some more, Paula, or if Raquel wants to come back in.
Can I just throw this quick comment in there to say, you know, just to add as a particular anecdote, the overwhelming response that people have had to the Belfast Multicultural Centre when it got destroyed by fire recently, and the level of support that the community have come to it with has been so reassuring for the community. It kind of reinforces the data that, okay, it's only a small pocket who feel this way, but the overwhelming majority of the community are actually supportive and positive towards, you know, well, this group in particular.
Okay, thank you. I just want to highlight a few of the comments. It's a bit of a random selection here, but they do pick up some of the points that have been coming through. Someone has mentioned there perhaps should be a need for the introduction of ethnic monitoring by public authorities in order to help tackle institutional racism. Then related to that, somebody else has mentioned that the use of different classifications on monitoring forms by public bodies, so that children and young people of Eastern European, Timorese or Portuguese cultures often have to tick the box saying other, which again would have a negative impact on people's identification, or also to define themselves by the colour of their skin. Then somebody has been asking, has there been a survey carried out from minority groups that could maybe be used to compare with the data that is available today? I don't know of such of a survey. I don't know, perhaps Lucy or Raquel, you would know of previous research, or perhaps anybody else, any of the other participants of the webinar today would know of some such research. And finally, our last comment is about somebody highlighting a higher education institution demanding evidence such as messages, photos, etc. from students when they're submitting a complaint about racial treatment from other students. And it's completely ignoring the microaggressions that are so common as well. So it's underlying day-to-day things that are going on as well, and the need to provide evidence as well, I think. So those are just some of the comments. So if anybody else has any comments or questions that they'd like to submit, then please do that through the chat function. Lucy, Raquel, I don't know if you have any responses.
Raquel, would you like to pick up first this time on ethnic minority, other classifications, surveys of minorities, or that word?
That's the very one I was thinking I would respond to. I have to say that personally, and this is me not speaking on behalf of Axoni now, I hate the term BME, Black and Minority Ethnic, Because for me, the minute you start to put minority in it, people reduce the people in that category and in that cohort as unimportant, insignificant. And then on top of that, why do I need to be defined just by the color of my skin? What, you know, why is that going to be what makes me count or not count? So I fully understand the comment that Louise was bringing up there, you know, about the monitoring forms, you know, how it categorizes people and the othering that takes place by people having to put themselves in these boxes. Not to mention the whole category of people. I think they were like the second largest cohort of the group who are mixed race, and they don't actually fit in one or other of those boxes, but they have to force themselves into one because that's what is that's what's allowed, that's what's been put there for them. So yeah, that is something I have a bugbear with that. One of the reasons I say very strongly that this is my view and I'm not representing anybody else's, I have not yet come up with a suitable substitute. I have not yet found, you know, the right terminology that would encompass the kinds of things that people want to be talking about with regards to these groups without othering them. So.
I really appreciate what you say on that, Raquel. I mean, I'm going to claim looking younger than I feel, but I've been in this space for a long time. And when I started in this area, BME was a relatively new acronym. And it was a shortcut for researchers and policymakers, really in terms of data. It wasn't something that was widely used to describe people. And so I really understand the resentment to BME and BAME as a label, as if you are just one of that thing. You know, you and I have both said, and the homogenizing assertions around Black and minority ethnic populations, you know, right across the UK where there are significant populations, as well as in Northern Ireland, where there's much smaller diverse populations. You know, you and I know that the huge diversity within those small numbers in Northern Ireland, and that mixed category is quite a category. Of course, we don't know within that mixed category what ethnic, racial, religious mixes people are referring to. It's a self-description. They describe them themselves as mixed, you know, and they use that category not as a way that they necessarily describe themselves in everyday life, where they might say, I'm British Guyanese, or I'm you know, French Nigerian, or whatever. But because it's a census category, you know, so putting that census category data up there right at the start, for me, was really about showing that is the level of data. You know, it's 9 years old, it's small, it puts everybody in one box. But that's what we have to work with. And when you then come to the equality monitoring in Northern Ireland, where you're from a Protestant background, a Catholic background, or other, it reinforces that. So our legal categories, our research categories can reinforce that exclusion as much as anything else. And certainly I would really caution people against taking those kinds of labels and using them to apply to people. So Raquel, please keep up that fight against BME. I'm right behind you on that. I want to pick up just on the other questions that you raised, Paula, on the survey of minorities. I think there is a real need to fund a booster sample of ethnic minorities. And I would love to see the Racial Equality Unit of the Northern Ireland Executive do that. I'm not aware of any ongoing surveys like the Northern Ireland Life and Times or Young Life and Times survey doing that. Some research projects have used a survey methodology to interrogate the experiences of a range of groups, but generally quite distinct groups, so they're not comparable across different surveys either. Raquel, maybe you know of anything that I'm not thinking of?
At the moment, I can't think of any, but it's worth you know, posing the question back to Axone and some of the other groups and seeing whether they are aware of any, but at the moment I can't think of any.
One of the great pities that has been is that when UK surveys are run, which include Northern Ireland, very often we don't get a disaggregation of that.
Yeah.
You know, the same is true that the Home Office won't disaggregate data on asylum seekers and refugees for Northern Ireland. So you can only get the Northern Ireland and Scotland data together and not the Northern Ireland data. But, you know, when I was looking at employment in Northern Ireland, we were using the Race into Work survey that Business in the Community had run in the UK. And again, we didn't have a disaggregation in Northern Ireland, apart from the fact that most of those big UK surveys are not promoted in Northern Ireland anyway. And so the sample sizes then tend to be small. So I think the answer to that generally is there are surveys ongoing, but not of the consistency and reliability and comparability of the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey. So there's definitely improvement to be there. But I must say, you know, huge kudos to Paula and all the team in ARK for consistently having good questions on the experiences of ethnic minority communities and attitudes towards them as well. And for always, you know, supporting me to do these research updates. It's great to have that data coming out into the public sphere in these kinds of conversations. The very last.
Sorry, Lucy, could I just pop in there? Just to say two things. Number one, the Life and Time survey, for people who don't know, is a random sample survey of people living across Northern Ireland. It's 1,200 adults aged 18 or over. And because it's a random sample survey, and because it means that we are very unlikely to pick up people from very specific backgrounds. So that's why we cannot disaggregate our data by anything. But somebody has mentioned that the Belfast Islamic Centre has done survey, but that's specifically for Muslim communities, but not specifically for other communities. They think perhaps Africa House has done so as well. So that's
again that difficulty, and that difficulty is true, by the way. I have to say, you know, in the UK and in the Republic of Ireland as well as in Northern Ireland, that a lot of these surveys are funded from small charitable trusts or from quality bodies that are for a very specific needs assessment of particular groups, rather than the kinds of data that we're looking at today around attitudes and so on. And, you know, I should say, even in the UK census, you know, the booster samples of ethnic minorities are problematic, you know, where there are much bigger figures. The last point you raised, Paula, was from somebody who was talking about the burden on complainants, students who complained about racial treatment, racially abusive treatment by other students, being asked for evidence. And I suppose I want to invite Raquel to comment on this, because it's something that I've come back to again and again, is that rather than being proactive and saying, okay, let's see what we can do in the round to create a positive ethos, it becomes about a litigation type scenario or a mediation between an abuser and a victim, very much influenced by a criminal justice process or an employment law kind of process, rather than, okay, if there's a problem with relations in students, let's do more and take leadership on this. Raquel, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's one of the areas that I'm quite intrigued by, actually, because I don't know whether people are familiar with the thought, the mindset that if you are a bystander, or let me not call you a bystander in those terms, but if you are a witness to racial harassment or racial bullying or any kind of racial incident or racial crime, if you are not the victim, it is way easier for you to be detached enough to get evidence than if you are the victim, because the level of shock that initially attaches itself to the experience almost always renders the victim unable to comprehend what needs to be done in that moment to address the situation. So when you do diversity training and cultural competence training, etc., this is one of the important messages we're trying to bring across to people across the world, really, that if you are there and you see it happening, don't wait for the victim to try and take photographs of what's happening or to voice record or video record what is happening. because by the time the shock has worn off and they actually get to articulate their thoughts, the moment when they could have taken that evidence is very likely gone. So it's up to the people who are around at that time to actually, you know, be responsible for bringing people to justice on incidents like that. And you know, it's almost like it's almost too simple to have to say it, that if there is an issue, you don't need to get down into who's got the evidence, who said, who he said, she said, what, you know, it doesn't need all of that for you to put things in place to make the situation better. You know, it kind of is obvious, but.
Thank you for that. And I suppose for the people who are here from organizations that are trying to think about how to deal with that proactively or respond in policy terms in education or health or workplaces with that, you know, I suppose just even thinking about the trauma of reporting something after the shock has passed, it can be really difficult for people who are victims as well. And if there's already a report in from a witness, it makes it easier. So really to rethink those reporting mechanisms, the involvement of people, and you know, even to think about that kind of calling in process, re-establishing your organization's values very clearly and very quickly, so that you bring everybody into that, rather than trying to make this about complainant versus abuser. There is a role in serious incidents for that, and certainly, you know, if somebody's been the victim of abuse, they absolutely are entitled to take a complaint, but they don't always want to. And very often that complaint process can exclude a victim much more than it re-includes them in the area and increases their sense of belonging. So thank you, Raquel, for that. Paula, do you want to pull up some more comments?
Just a couple more comments. One is talking about calls from the Equality Commission about legal reform by way of the Single Equality Act. So that recognises people's multiple identities. So that's something that we were talking about, and how people see themselves, and we know that we don't have just one identity. But there's a feeling that this has been resisted in government over the last 20 years. And perhaps that could be something that would help us rethink identity within our society. I don't know if Lucy, Jenny or Raquel, any thoughts on that?
Thanks, Paul, for raising that and for being here today. Yeah, I think Raquel may agree with me on this. When we actually get data in about the level of diversity in our society, you know, and we don't just categorize people by one identity, then we stop thinking of Northern Ireland in terms of Protestant background, Catholic background, and other, and we start to say, you know, we know a number of years ago that if you were from a different ethnic background, people would say, ah, yeah, but are you Protestant or are you Catholic? You know, and acknowledging that people can be of different ethnicities and from different political persuasions and from different religions, to see that diversity is really important. We see that diversity even within white, Irish, British, Protestant, Catholic, unionist, nationalist communities. You know, the mix of politics, religion, and so on is much greater than it was 10 years ago, and particularly 20 years ago. Capturing the data on that would really start to disrupt that sense that there are solid communities that sit against one another instead of side by side and amongst one another. Raquel, your thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not so sure if our research methods at the moment have the capacity to capture the levels of intersectionality that exist within us as dynamic people. But that is a very real issue. You know, nobody self-defines as only one thing. And when we capture our data, we are trying to capture it in only one area at a time, which makes it quite tricky. But we do need to find ways to be able to cross-reference some of these things and to open up the categories a little bit more. You know, I so often have to fill out application forms and funding documents, etc. And it's all about either the political or the religious side of the community that you come from. And I'm thinking, can we just put all of that away and just start again? You know, just let's just talk about what really needs to be done and not kind of try and figure. Now, I mean, I fully understand and appreciate with all the history that has gone on, the importance to begin to meet in the middle, and the importance that data has to play in that, and the importance that counting people on one side or another has to play in that. So I'm not discounting that, but at the same time, we cannot be tunnel visioned in the way we view these things and the way we describe and categorize people.
I think it's really shown up by some of the data that we've looked at in the ARK reports previously around, you know, where Poles are living in Northern Ireland. You know, there are quite significant Polish settlements within unionist and loyalist communities, and integration projects around that. We've also seen, you know, in the past, you know, early 2000s, we saw South Asian communities were much more likely to settle in unionist areas, again, because they were British South Asian. And so those kinds of understandings of intersectionality, I think, are really useful. It's one of the reasons, actually, I like the breakdown in the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey, because we do get to pick into some of that, despite the small sample size. It does at least let us interrogate that difference between our identities. Paula?
Hey, well, I think we've come to the end of our allotted time, so I just want to say thank you so much to Lucy and to Raquel for such fascinating insights, and it highlights the concerns that we all should have in terms of this as individual people within our schools, within our communities, for policymakers, for researchers, and for institutions as well, that it's not just something that affects other people, it's for everybody. As the one commenter has just said, that's why we should start at school, the playground, the sports fields, the arts groups, family, community work, social levels. And again, there's a huge, you have both called out huge challenges to the policymakers and to researchers as well in order to reflect that. So thank you very much, Lucy and Raquel, and thank you very much for everybody who has joined us today. The data is all on our website. We hope to have the slides and the video from today's event up on our website soon, and we will email you when that is available as well. Lucy has written a short research update that goes along with that, and again, we'll send you the link to that as well. The survey, the Life and Time survey, ran in 2020, despite the challenges that last year brought us, and we hope to have the data publicly available by mid-June. So hopefully you'll join us again then, when we will be highlighting the results from the 2020 survey. So in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye and stay safe. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.